Today I'm building a mid-level micro ATX PC, parts list linked in the description. The motherboard is a micro ATX ASRock B550M-HDV, which will mount a Be Quiet ASRock TF2 heatsink and a 32GB G.Skill Ripjaws 3200MHz RAM kit. The system will be powered with an EVGA Supernova 850 GT, and storage will be handled by a 3TB Seagate Barracuda, two 1TB Samsung 870 EVO SSDs, and the OS drive is a 970 EVO Plus. The central processor is a Ryzen 9 5900X with 12 cores, 24 threads, and the graphics processor is an XFX Speedster RX 7700 XT. I'm going to try to fit all of this into a 26.5-liter Johnsbow D30 chassis. So first, I'm going to prep the motherboard by removing the standard heatsink mounting brackets and install the ones for the Be Quiet ASRock TF2, a pretty standard step for most aftermarket coolers. Next, I'm going to click in the RAM and seat the AM4 CPU. I had to do a quick mock-up to make sure I have clearance for RAM and fan headers, and I found that this screw hole was going to be blocked by the heatsink, which means I needed to crack open the case and install the motherboard before mounting the heatsink. After clicking in the I/O panel and moving the mounting screws around, it's time to squish some thermal grease out onto the CPU and line up the heatsink. There isn't really enough room to see what I'm doing, so I had to go in blind with a telescopic screwdriver, but we're all set. Now I'm going to mount the storage drive, starting with the M.2, then the 2.5-inch SSDs, and then the hard disk on the bottom of the chassis. Toss some intake fans down at the bottom, replace the dust filter, exhaust fan on the rear, route the fan cables to the other side of the chassis, mount the power supply, plug in the extension cable, route even more cables, plug in fan splitters, plug in the fans, do even more cable management with twist ties and fan splitters, and it's just all part of the process. Don't you love it? To get into the tiny space between the heatsink and the chassis, I use a slot head screwdriver to direct and plug in the power cable. I route it through the back and then plug it into the power supply. This is going to be a first for me, but I'm going to use these angled adapters to help with cable management because it's such a small chassis. I'm putting my trust in them. I don't know if I should. Time to break out the manual for the front panel header, which I just love so much, especially in such a small space with even more cables to manage. Kind of feeling a little bit constricted. Is this even art or something? Does anyone even care? So then I tried desperately for about 20 minutes to get this massive graphics card between the rear PCIe panel and the cluster of power cables at the front. Now we just make sure everything is seated properly and install the 2.5-inch SSD panel. I tossed in a GPU riser to fix the sag in the 7700 XT, but I had to take it out later because it was interfering with the cooling fans, but there wasn't any more room to put it anywhere else. So I put the riser base behind the SSD drive panel to prop up the GPU between the HDD and the power cables wrapped around the end of the card. Once I put it all together and updated the BIOS, I was in business.